Caroline Dowd-Higgins. Thank you for listening to Your Working Life, my podcast series featuring thought leaders in the career and personal growth arena. I know that you spend a significant portion of your life at work, so I'm on a mission to provide you with tools, inspiration, and resources so you can enjoy your career and love your life. And I am so thrilled and delighted to welcome my very special guest to the show today, Gail Sheehy. Gail, welcome.
Oh, I'm so happy to be with you, Caroline.
Thank you, my dear. I'm delighted about your brand new book, Daring My Passages, a memoir by Gail Sheehy. Gail, I've been a longtime fan of yours and certainly a fan and an avid reader. I've read it so many times of your original book passages, so I'm just thrilled to have you on and have a great conversation with you today. But I do want to tell our listening audience a little bit more about you. Most of our listeners know you are just an iconic role model in the literary world, but for those who may not know you, Gail Sheehy is the author of 16 books, including the classic New York Times bestseller, Passages, named by the Library of Congress as one of the 10 most influential books of our time. As a literary journalist, Gail Sheehy was one of the original contributors to New York Magazine and has been a contributing editor to Vanity Fair since 1984. She's a 7-time recipient of the New York Newswomen's Club Front Page Award for Distinguished Journalism and 3-time winner or finalist for the National Magazine Awards. Gail, welcome. And I'm really excited to talk about your brand new book. It's a memoir called My Passages. Now tell me, what does the word daring mean to you? Because it starts out daring my passages. That's intense.
That's right. Well, I have to ask my audiences the same thing. Have you dared? Do you dare? What is daring? When was the last time you dared to do something you'd never tried before? You sucked at it, but you went back and did it again.
Yeah, yeah.
And when was the last time when your spouse chewed you out that you stepped back, a keto style, and let it go? Would you dare? Would you dare to step out of your comfort zone? I mean, way out, and go somewhere, do something to learn something about the world or about yourself?
Now, Gail, you've been a long time trailblazer, and you and I are very passionate about empowering women. And you were a trailblazer early on in a man's world. You took on assignments when you had very little experience in the beginning of your career, traveling to war zones, going undercover. How did you muster up that courage to be daring early on as a very young woman?
Well, I grew up in an era in the 1950s as a child before helicopter parents. So I
Mm.
did a lot of daring things when I was a kid. And one of the things I did was to take a train out of my little cozy suburb in Westchester when I was like 8, 9 years old. My grandmother gave me the money, and we used to listen to a radio show called Grand Central Station, Crossroads of a Million Private Lives. And I just had to go and see all these other kinds of lives. So I would take the train in 43 minutes, go up to the top of the marble balcony, and look down on this crossroads of lives and make up stories about people. And it made me feel like I had control, even though I was a little girl, and little girls didn't count for much in those days. But I had a paper and a pad, and I
Wow.
could make up stories.
That's amazing. And you're such a fine storyteller. You really are. Can you harken back to your first assignment as a journalist?
Oh, well, Clay Felker, who was the founder of New York Magazine, and for whom I had written at the precursor of the magazine at the Herald Tribune, but the very night that he had launched New York Magazine, a big party at the Four Seasons, I couldn't go. I was a divorced single mom at home with my 2.5-year-old.
Hmm.
He suddenly this limousine pulled up underneath my fourth floor walk up grungy building, and my lookout on the first floor, a Ukrainian seamstress, rang my intercom and said, "He's coming up, a fancy man." And the fancy man walked in with his black tie and said, you know, what do you know about politics? And I said, what? Well, my father's a country club Republican. My mother is a natural bomb throwing Irish radical. So I know about politics. It's about arguing at the dinner table. He said, great, then you'll understand Bobby. I said, Bobby? Who? He said, Bobby Kennedy. I said, well, Bobby Kennedy? He said, yes, I want you to go to California and cover his presidential campaign. I said,
Wow.
Clay, I've never written a political story. He said, Gail, don't, I'm going to give you a piece of advice. Don't write a lot of little stories. Nobody's going to remember them. Write a big story that everybody's talking about, but they don't know the why.
Mm, wow.
And he
And that's
sent me out,
exactly.
and because I dared to do that, and of course I was scared to death, I got to have one of the last interviews with Robert Kennedy before he was assassinated.
Oh my goodness. I so appreciate that you are willing to admit that yes, you were scared. Hell yes, you were scared. I think
Of
that's such
course.
an important thing for all of us to embrace, and that's okay, right? Just embracing the unknown and embracing the fear.
Well, I found out after I did it a few times that I was more uncomfortable by sitting with the fear and fighting with myself about why I didn't do it and what might have happened than I was with taking the dare. So
Mm,
I eventually came to realize that when I fear, I dare.
nice. Very good. Now, Gail, you also dared to be a single mom while working full time, and I know so many of our women listeners can relate to that today. So, how
Oh,
did you find the
absolutely.
strength? What was your support network?
Well, to begin with, I didn't choose to be divorced. I had a whole other life plan, married a medical student, and I was the breadwinner. And we had this lovely young child, and it turned out my husband preferred to have an affair with one of my better friends. And that was really not tolerable. So I had to dare to get divorced. And then I had to be the breadwinner. I mean, I had to work full time. There wasn't any choice. And I liked working full time. I wanted to have a career. I wanted to be independent. And especially after that experience, I never wanted to be financially dependent on anybody else. So I had to hire, incompetent house sitters, babysitters for the first year until I just realized that it just wouldn't work. So I
Mm,
had to quit my dream job at the Herald Tribune and start freelancing way before I was ready to do so. But I was fortunate in that Clay Felker started New York Magazine as an independent, and since he knew that I could write, he gave me an assignment, the Bobby Kennedy assignment, and then from then on, for 7 years, I worked with the most talented, incredible family, the New York Magazine family. We were living at the peak of the magazine culture. And we were starting something totally new. There'd never been a city magazine before. And we had such talented people, Tom Wolfe and Gloria Steinem, and the vicious black-haired Irishman Jimmy Breslin, but he was funny as hell, and Andy Tobias and Aaron Latham and Steve Brill and lots of wonderful people. And Clay would have editorial lunches at the Palm restaurant near the UN, and there'd be about 10 of us. We all had to have at least two good story ideas to throw out on the table. And instead of fighting each other, we'd actually help each other. It was a real group effort. In hey, I know that I got a source for you. Wait a second. I know a lot more about Billy Graham than you do. Let's talk about it afterwards. And then off in the corner would be George Bush Sr., who
yeah.
was then the envoy to our ambassador to the UN, and he'd be sitting with one pretty girl after another, depending on the week. So it was just a fabulous petri dish for growing as a journalist and growing in a new form, which we called new journalism.
But what a wonderful team. And it sounds like you really did have each other's backs.
We did, yeah.
That's
Uh,
extraordinary.
yeah.
Gail, tell me, Clay is such an important part of your life and your career, and you write about him so eloquently in the book. What was it like working and loving with Clay Felker?
Tempestuous.
Mm, love that word.
Um, we were creative intimates. At first, what came first was sharing the excitement of when we lived together, which we did off and on for 17 years before we married. Getting up in the morning, going to the newspapers. He'd get 5 different newspapers. They'd be spread all over the floor under the kitchen table, and we'd be, tearing up the world and arguing and coming up with story ideas. It was so exciting. And then he'd run to the office, and I'd run to my little rental office after I took my daughter to school, and start tapping out a story. And then we'd meet at the end of the day, and then I'd have to take care of my daughter and read her a story and give her a bath and feed her. And then Clay would be home. Why aren't you dressed? We're going to dinner. We're going to be at the ambassador so and so's house tonight. So it was just a whirlwind.
I bet.
And finally, I came, not finally, but when I was 32, I wanted to do a very special story. And I had to try to persuade Clay, who was not an easy mark. I said, begged him to send me to Northern Ireland at the peak of the Troubles. And he said, why Northern Ireland? I say, that's just the point. Why? Why is the British Army and the Irish Catholic people, why are they at each other's throats? Who really knows what's going on there? And he said, what does that have to do with New York? He had a huge voice. I said, well, half the population of New York is Irish, aren't they? But that's not the story. The story is the women.
Yeah.
What about the women? I said, they're leading the fight. Most of their men are in prison. So they're banging the bin lids on the street to warn of raids. They're even shooting British soldiers. He said, okay, write about the women. And the next thing that happened when I was there, I still to this day can hardly believe how fast it happened. I was in the Catholic ghetto, marching with the Civil Rights March, beautiful sunny Sunday afternoon. We marched down to the barricades. We did all the things we were supposed to do. The British Army threw their tear gas. We vomited our guts. Then everybody dropped back into a nice community square, and neighbors were greeting neighbors. And I walked up the outside steps of a flat, wanting to get a larger view. I was standing next to a young boy, and I was asking him, how can the paratroopers fire their gas canisters so far? And he said, see them jamming their rifle butts in the ground. And right then, a bullet tore into his face, became a bloody mass. He dropped at my feet. I bent over him, thinking, how can I mend him? Because up until that moment in my life, I could mend everything. But he was bleeding to death. And the next thing a man fell in on me and said, move, we're in crosswire, IRA's on the roof. And we became a caterpillar of 4 or 5 people inching our way on the belly up the steps until somebody had to crawl out in crossfire and bang on a door to get us taken in. And of course I hesitated. I was scared.
Sure.
But a bullet passed practically in front of my nose. It just seemed to stand in the air. And I then moved and threw myself against a door, and we were taken in. And that was Bloody Sunday. They didn't send out invitations to Bloody Sunday. They called it that afterwards. But I had to then be escorted by an IRA commander up a hill to go to a safe house because I had recorded the whole thing on my tape recorder. And they wanted me to use it in a future court, which I did. But for the moment, I was positioned with a family, an old woman and a man whose son, a priest, had gone across the border to help take some of his IRA pals escape. And the parents were playing on their old Victrola the Long Kesh prison song at top volume. And the British soldiers were kicking doors in down the street to find any other IRA they could. And I said, what are you going to do when they come kicking in here? And the old lady said, lie on my stomach.
Oh, my goodness.
So I said, could I make a phone call? She said, just one. So I call Clay, with whom I was living. And who loved me and I loved him, and here I was in mortal danger, and he was my one chance for deliverance. So I
Yeah.
called him and said, and he said, "How's the story coming?" And I said, "13 people were massacred here today." He said, "Oh, wait a minute, I'm watching it on CBS right now." I said, "Clay, they're calling it Bloody Sunday." He said, "Gail, just stay with the women. Just stay with the women and be safe, okay, honey?" Well, he just didn't get it. That was the first and only time that Clay didn't get it.
Mm.
And I felt totally alone. No one was ever going to protect me. There was no one who was never going to leave me alone. I really had to come to terms in the next 6 months or year with the arithmetic of life, that there really was an end to life and it could happen anytime. And
Wow.
that brought on a midlife crisis, which then led to my writing passages.
Gail, your recounting of that story is as if it was yesterday. It's so visceral, it's so palpable, it's so real. But what strikes me is a wonderful thread because you write about this in the book, women helping women. And specifically in chapter 13, I've got your book right in front of me. Tell me more about women helping women and how that's impacted you in your life.
Well, I had a wonderful mentor in Margaret Mead,
Mm.
uh, an intimidating woman, but she was a professor at Columbia, and I was on a fellowship there, where the opportunity was to study with anyone you wished. And I chose her as an anthropologist because comparing subcultures to the core culture of America was what I wanted to do. And she was fascinated that I worked for New York Magazine.
Yeah.
And so she would give me ideas for stories, and I became kind of her foot soldier, doing stories on nuclear power and the fractured family and the first bachelor mothers. And so in exchange for that, she would let me ride with her up and down to school and teach me how to write about subcultures, like the Black Panthers, which were
Hmm.
big at the time, uh, and compare them to the core culture. And that way you could really place them in the context of American life. So she was enormously helpful to me. And then Gloria Steinem and I struck up a comradeship because both of us were approaching feminism
Hmm.
uh, a couple of years after it had started, and it was very radical at the time, at the beginning. She was writing about it for New York Magazine. I was writing about it in a somewhat satirical way, as to keep my distance a little bit, because we were worried about the same thing that women are worried about it today. Do I have to give up being a female woman?
Mm.
Do I have to give up on saying I really like men and I like sex?
Hmm.
Uh,
Yeah.
well, of course you don't, but lots of people think it's an either or. So she wanted to publish a magazine, and she had the whole idea. She had a dummy issue called Ms., but she couldn't raise the money to get it started. So Clay uh, gave her the opportunity to publish it inside the covers of New York Magazine and paid for the writers and the publication. And that got people interested and excited, and the magazine was launched. So I felt like we had sort of helped her with that, and she had helped Clay to start his magazine by, as she called it, tap dancing for rich people to get them interested in in contributing.
That's
Um,
brilliant.
yeah, and then such an odd combination between Gloria Steinem and then another woman who helped me was Helen Gurley Brown,
Yeah.
who was just starting Cosmopolitan, and it was about mouse burgers like herself. They were women mainly from small towns and in the Middle West who weren't particularly attractive. They didn't come from a socially prominent family. They probably didn't even have a college education, but they had a lot of daring. And
Yes.
she was telling them how they could use that to have a great career.
That's great.
And she had proved it herself. So she called me up one day and said, "I want you to go to India and write about the Maharishi, who was the Beatles' Indian guru."
Right.
And again, it was one of those dares. I went, what? I've never even, been out of the country. I had to get a passport in 48 hours, and I went with, I think, just a tote bag with a couple of changes of clothing.
Wow.
And God knows why she hired me after that, because it was an enthralling experience. But when I came home, I was running to meet my daughter. Her father was bringing her to meet me on the outskirts of Central Park. I was so excited. I grabbed her up and twirled around, and we ran across the park. And when I got home, the notebook that I had carried all over India, with in my back of my jeans pocket, was gone. I mean, it's the worst thing that can happen to a writer.
Right.
And the only thing I could do was to put Maura to bed and lie on what I fantasized was my bed of nails and meditate and just let the whole experience wash over me again. And by the next morning, I was able to write. And then Helen called me up and said, "This is terrific." I had just at that point um, had I had a supposedly um, Otto Preminger was going to make a film of the first book I wrote, which was a love story about the breakup of my marriage. And he called me up to say that his studio had found out that I didn't have the rights to the book, that the agent hadn't protected them, so they didn't have to make the film. So my job had just fallen through. Maura was having a meltdown. My divorce papers had arrived. It was really seemed like the end of my life. And then Helen called up and said, "I'd like to, I'd like you to write once a month for a year. Are you up for it?" Well, I mean, she saved my life.
Yes, yes, that was a lifeline. That's
Yeah.
great. That's amazing. Gail, did you have the sense at that time that you were forging the way for women writers? I mean, you speak to women so eloquently, but certainly men appreciate your message as well. But you really gave women a voice. Did you get that sense at that point in time, or did it take some time to really understand the magnitude of your work?
Oh, it took so long, Caroline, that when I published, when Passages was published, I really thought it would sink pretty much without a trace because I wasn't a psychiatrist. I didn't have a medical degree. So, and a psychiatrist actually who wanted to collaborate with me had threatened me, had poked my greatest fears. He said, "Nobody will take you seriously. You're just a
Wow.
journalist." And I did have the daring finally to say to him, "I don't really want a collaborator. I really want to write my own book, and you can write your own book."
Good for
And
you.
I made him go away. But I thought that it would sink without a trace. And so uh, I actually ran away with my daughter and my best friend to Italy for a week to just so I wouldn't have to face bad reviews. But Clay called at the end of that week and said, "There's a review in the New York Times. You want to hear it?" And I said, "No, I don't want to even hear it." And he said, "Well, how would you like to hear that you're numero uno on the New York Times
Wow.
bestseller list?" Well, it was just completely unbelievable to me. It took a long time to come to terms with that. And so many people have talked about, the destabilization, the kind of chaos of having a sudden success. And it is wonderful, but it also shakes up all your relationships. Everybody's attitude towards you changes in one way or another. And took, and but then I began to hear, particularly from women, but not only men too, saying, "I didn't realize. I mean, I can actually change my life, and
Yes.
it doesn't mean that I'm unstable or that I'm sick or neurotic or, that's actually the best thing that can happen is to recognize when you need to make change, and then it can be a leap of growth." So I began to understand that a lot of people had been kind of stuck in conformity, left over from the corporate era.
Hmm.
And now here we were in the middle of the 70s, which was the epicenter of the earthquake of gender. So it wasn't only about gender change or sexual preference change, but it was really about following your passion, figuring out who you are, what's right for you, instead of following a safe script. And so many people did that.
Well, Gail, what I love about Passages it has stood the test of time. It is truly timeless, and you've empowered so many individuals to give themselves permission to change. So, myself included. I mean, I'm a groupie.
So
I was
bad.
so impacted by that book, and so I just hope you know how powerful it has been and continues to be today. It's awesome in the true beautiful sense of the word. So I thank you for that from personal experience. But I want to segue now. You speak so beautifully in the book in chapter 7 I'm thinking of, because again I've got your book right in front of me, about failing up. So tell us what that means.
Well, e- especially today, failure is almost the default position uh, towards moving on to starting something new. And so many people are trying startups. Um, and the luckiest thing is if you fail early,
Mhm.
because you then can find out you don't die from it. And
True.
I did fail early, and when I discovered that I could, one of the things that I did, a really, really foolish thing, I eloped from college 3 weeks after I started at the University of Vermont. How stupid was that? But it was so romantic. Oh my goodness, my boyfriend is coming up to my dorm at midnight after curfew. He has an extension ladder in his truck. He's a surgeon. He's going to take me away and we're going to have a wonderful life together. And I get all dressed up. I even have heels on. All the all the girls in my dorm come to their windows with their rollers in. They're all singing me down, and I'm climbing down a ladder in heels and falling into his arms. Well, we didn't get to the border before I had to stop and call my mother. And he was very suspicious. Why do you have to call your mother? Well, I always tell my mother what I'm doing, which I didn't. But that time I did. I was scared, and I called her up and I said, "Mom, um, I'm eloping, and with a surgeon." And she said, "Is it McCarthy?" I said, "Well, yes." And she said, "He's a tree surgeon." I said, "I know, but he's really wonderful and we're going to have a great time." And she said, "Honey," and then she started to talk to me, like a child, petting my hair. "Honey, just think how nice it will be to plan your wedding. Just come on home and we'll start talking about it. We can have it in the backyard of the new house and we'll pick out a dress together. It'll really be fun." I said, "Can I talk to my father?" And she said, "Well, I've just told him about McCarthy. He can't come to the phone now." I said, "Why not?" "He's looking for his shotgun." So
Oh.
I did go home and I was easily talked out of this foolish idea. I had to call all of my professors and ask them if they would forgive me and let me come back, and they agreed. And I was so grateful for that second chance, for having failed to act like a grown up and get a second chance, that I became a born again uh, virgin
There you go.
until I
Oh.
was married.
There's a tweet, Gail, if ever there was one. That's beautiful. Thank you for that. Well, and again, thank you for giving us permission to fail up, to fail forward, and to try, and to take a risk and to dare. That's what I love about you, and I love about this book. So let's go back to the new book, Daring My Passages, a memoir by Gail Sheehy. What do you want people to get from reading this new book, Gail?
Well, I want them to see that, you know, we have a longer life than ever, and we have many, many seasons. So we don't have to get hung up on this idea of having it all, or having it all at once and early, because I don't really think it's possible for men or women. I think you have some of it, and then you add some more, and maybe you let go of some of it for a while you're emphasizing other things. And in my case, I didn't really have it all until I was in my mid 40s when I remarried, and my husband and I adopted a child, my second child, and his first. And that was wonderful. And we had a whole second adulthood, which I think many people can have after 45 or 50. You start all over again. For many people, it's when they have an empty nest And what now? Well, most women who go into politics don't go into politics until they're after 45.
Right, right.
And it takes them longer to get to the top, but that's when they're really free to speak their mind and give their whole heart to trying to change the world. And today, we know people have 6, 7, 8 different career lives. So being free to change, and you're not going to have it all if you start a new business when you're 45 and you've got to put half your life savings into it, or downsize your living situation while you nurture a new business. But that's okay because it's going to give you a new life, a new start. So I want people to see that I've had many adventures in my life, some major setbacks, and some big chances that I took that worked out. And, ultimately, I had it all. And then my husband got sick with cancer well into our marriage. And we had 17 years where he had different forms of cancer. We had long respites in between, which made us feel incredibly grateful and powerful. And then ultimately, he had to leave me and the world, and I had to come back. And that's really hard.
Sure.
But I have to tell people that you have to begin that journey back before you lose your loved one. Otherwise, when you lose your role as caregiver, who are you?
Mm-hmm.
You
Yeah.
have to have an identity left.
Gail, you've also started this incredible new movement, for lack of a better term, the Gail Sheehy Daring Project online. Now, I know you and I have spoken about this, so I know a lot about it, but tell our listeners, what is it and how can others participate?
Well, I'm so glad you asked, Caroline, because I really want to encourage young women to be bold. Many young women today are much bolder than we were in my era, but there's also the hangover of insecurity from the meltdown of the economy in 2008 and the joblessness that has been a kind of a plague on
Right.
young people's future. So the natural instinct would be to be very materialistic and to grab onto something safe and sure, a corporate ladder, perhaps, although we know that's not really secure. But they're actually not going in that direction. Many millennials say in a big national survey that they would rather take a $40,000 a year job and that was exciting and challenging than a $100,000 a year job that was boring,
Mm-hmm.
where they get stuck. So they've made a big leap in understanding how to get started in life, and I want to dare them, more of them, to be daring, starting their own thing, um, moving around from one channel or another during their 20s until they find where they are really excited and where time passes and they don't even know it. That's where they belong. So I'm asking people to come to my website. It's called Sheehy Daring Project, www.sheehy Daring Project, and submit a little capsule of their most daring moment. And if it's good, I'll call them, interview them, and pay them a small fee and publish it on my website. There's a lot of stories up on my website already that I think are very inspiring. And I hope people will go to Sheehy Daring Project and read them.
Absolutely. Well, I'll tell you, you are an inspiration for all, but the others who are also showcased on your website are extraordinary. So I would strongly encourage all of our listeners to check out shehedaringproject.com online. Speaking of social media, Gail, how can we best follow you online? I know you're on Twitter, you're on Facebook. Can you also tell us your Gail Sheehy website? It's gailsheehy.com, if I remember correctly.
Yes, it's quite simple. It's just gailsheehy.com, and it has a showcase of all my books. Uh, it has a news feed. It has my calendar
Hmm.
because I'm starting a book tour on the day after Labor Day.
Yes, you
Uh,
are. Let's mention some of the things. You've got the Harvard Club in New York coming up. You're at the East Hampton Library. You're going to be doing an episode on the Tavis Smiley Show. Then you're heading to LA and San Francisco. So you're a busy woman these next few months on the book tour.
I know, right up to Thanksgiving. And
Yes,
I love this. It's exhausting, but it's so exciting
good for
because you,
you.
you take the pulse of the country, at one time in history. And this is a great time to take the pulse of our culture because we're all pretty uncertain and a lot of us very dubious about whether we're on the right road
Right.
because the world is falling into chaos and we're going to be with that for quite some time. So, how are people dealing with that? We have great resilience as Americans, and I want to see how people are thinking and adjusting their lives to a new reality out there.
Well, Gail, what a joy to have you on the show. And I want to remind our listeners that Daring My Passages, a memoir by Gail Sheehy, will be available in September at all major book retailers, as well as online, right? We can buy the book on Amazon and Barnes and Noble online as well.
You can
And
pre-order it.
yes, you can. And believe me, I've had my copy for weeks. Well,
Oh,
I've got the
excellent.
advanced reader copy, right, because of our interview. But you're right, you can queue up and pre-order. And you and I will get to see each other in person in October in Indianapolis because you are one of the speakers at the Indiana Governors Conference for Women. So I look forward to that.
I'm
And
so
I
excited
I
about that.
hope we can motivate some of the amazing women in the Midwest to come out and hear you speak in person, not only about the Daring Project, but also about my passages.
And tell me about their daring stories.
Absolutely, absolutely. Well, again, it doesn't surprise me because you're such an extraordinary woman, but you're paying it forward, giving others an opportunity to inspire others to be daring. So thank you for that, Gail. You are a joy. I treasure you. As I said, I've been one of your groupies and followers for a long time, and I say that with an absolute smile on my face and warmth in my heart. So I thank you for what you have done to inspire me. And thank you for sharing your time with me on the show today.
I'm following you and always will.
Okay, my dear. Well, you take good care. We will connect in person in a few months, and I am eager, eager to spread the word about your fabulous new book.
Well, I look forward to meeting you again.
Thanks,
Thank you.
Gail. Be well, my dear. And I want
Thank
to thank our listeners for tuning into Your Working Life, where my goal is to help you design your career destiny so it doesn't happen by default. True career and life satisfaction is really possible, and it's time to embrace what you love doing so you can do more of it. I'm Caroline Dowd-Higgins. Take good care.